Hey now, it is Dan Aberhart here, and welcome to the Growing the Future podcast, where we talk to folks who like to innovate, they like to collaborate, and they like to transform the agricultural industry. Thank you so much for joining us for Season 5, Episode 13. Today is something very different and very special. Recently, somebody asked me if I knew anything about vertical farming from an investment perspective. And I had to admit that, just because I'm involved in horizontal farming doesn't mean I know anything about vertical farming. And so I endeavored to find some experts. And of course, I thought of Rob Sake and Advisor Pro. I know they've touched on this, so I reached out to this individual through that platform. We got connected, and it turns out we have lots of synchronicities that we're going to be discussing on the show today. So, hey, we want to open up your minds, and maybe there'll be a vertical farm on your horizontal farm coming to you soon. It would be great to see that. But before I introduce today's esteemed guest, I'd like to remind you to check out the Aberhart family of companies online, if you would be so kind, starting with aberhartfarms.com, where we grow food to feed the world in Langeberg, Saskatchewan. Suregrowth.ca, where we offer precision agronomy consulting services. ConvergenceGrowth.com, where we accelerate solutions across food, health, and agriculture. And AberhartAgSolutions.ca, where we deliver one-of-a-kind fertility solutions of the future to your farm. You can also get notified about our new episodes by signing up for our newsletter at growingthefuturepodcast.ca. My next guest is a podcasting guru. He has done 9 seasons of the Vertical Farming Podcast. He is also the host of Podcasting Junkies and founder of Fullcast. He has over 20 years of corporate marketing experience. He's written a book called Around the Podcast Campfire, and he speaks on stage about the importance of finding your voice. Today we're going to talk about vertical farming. I'm going to be asking questions like a third grader here, getting the basics, so hang with me. And I do want to talk to this individual a little bit about podcasting and the podcasting business and marketing and finding your voice. And of course, we've got to hear about how he is the cosmic conduit for awakened souls ready to transmit their genius on a global scale. I might start levitating here. You'll have to see it on YouTube. Welcome to the show, Harry Duran.
Dan, thank you so much for that fantastic intro, and thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share some time with you and your audience.
Well, hey, I take it that you're a really creative guy, and I caught it on your LinkedIn that part of your journey was DJing in Germany, and that's kind of what translated into some of these talents, going forward with the media and stuff like that. Tell us a little bit about who you are. I guess you're I don't know if you're of that generation that you could have been named after Duran, but maybe that's, But tell us about who you are and how you got to sharing your talents with the world and sharing other people's talents with the world as well, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about my journey is that your listener can relate to it, because it's gonna be similar to a path that they've been on. I was in corporate world for 20 plus years, and I remember for me, the thread was always this idea of like listening to other people's voices. And so in the beginning, it was my dad. Like, he would tell me like, hey, you got to listen to these books on tape. And he'd play, actually, I think it was vinyl. It might've been actually cassette. I think it was like Think and Grow Rich and something. And he was on the right path. And I wish I had paid more attention, because now I see the wisdom of those teachings back then. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, this is good. I really should be doing that. But I didn't really pay that much close attention. He said, you got to go to college, you got to finish college. I started college, but then I got a job in banking, and I was like, well, that's it. I don't need to finish college. I get to wear a suit, so that means it's official. Like, I made it. And so I got my job, and I got into banking. I worked at Chase. It's actually started in Manufacturers Hanover, which was bought by Chemical, which was bought by Chase, which merged with JP Morgan Chase. So that was an interesting world of banking. And then I landed a job with a guy that I called my corporate godfather. And he was always promoting me and pushing me to other positions. I ended up working with him at E-Trade as well. So I cut my teeth in corporate marketing at those two organizations. But I always had an entrepreneurial bug. And I remember sometime during the dot-com craze, I decided to leave. The first time I left, I think I was at Chase at the time, to start a job with a Latino portal. So I was following this other guy's voice, my friend John, who I'm still good friends with. I left. I cashed out my 401k to zero, and I took an unpaid position as a VP of operations, air quotes for those that are listening at home. And that didn't really pan out because we probably would be having a different conversation if that did. But I ended up having to come back and go to work, and looked up my boss again, and he said, okay, let's get you a job again. So did that. And then later on, I was working at E-Trade, and then I had a job. I connected with my half brother in Atlanta, and he's like, oh, you got to go like work with me. I work in construction of all things. So again, this was like 2001. I left, the digital marketing world I was in. Yeah, I think it was still at Chase, and I went to go work for him. And I was in construction, literally like takeoffs of blueprints, hard hat, climbing scaffolds, like, completely out of my element. But I learned how to take off blueprints, and we actually landed a couple of gigs with the state of Georgia because I moved down there. But what they say about working with family, that didn't pan out. And like 2 years later, I was back at home with my tail between my legs, going to live with my parents again. And so I think I was 34 at the time. And he, connected with my corporate godfather again, and that's what I ended up at E-Trade, and then I had a really nice run there. But I always had this calling, and I think what was interesting is that I had this passion for electronic music. I grew up DJing. I literally learned how to DJ on vinyl, beat matching. So not one of those laptop DJs you see now. I actually had to learn how to analog DJ. So that's like my number one passion. And I was starting a mobile app on the side. I was like, I'm going to create a mobile app, kind of like Pandora, but just for electronic music. And I want to learn how to podcast because I want to interview DJs. That was my goal. I wanted to talk to these famous DJs. I studied a little bit of acting when I was in New York. And I don't know if you remember this show called Inside the Actor Studio with James Lipton. And I thought it was always fascinating how you could get an insight into these actors by watching them on the screen for an hour as opposed to just seeing them in a movie. And I was like, I want to do that for podcasting. And that's where my first show was born, Podcast Junkies, in 2014, because I went to go learn how to do that at a conference. And I was off and running. I had to figure everything out on my own. For a whole year, I did everything. And I was literally, editing the video, booking the guests, doing the interviews, doing the graphics. I was ordering shirts. I was going to these conferences. I was giving away T-shirts. I was just literally all guerrilla marketing stuff, that I was learning how to grow a show. And then hired a business coach. I remember this saying by someone, inspirational speaker by the name of Jim Rohn. He says, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And that really resonated with me. I didn't learn a lot about digital marketing during my, university time or in my corporate world. So I had to pay a coach. I was paying him $1,500 a month to teach me all the things, what I call digital Narnia. And I was meeting all these 6-figure, 7-figure business owners. I didn't even know this world existed. And so that opened the light for me. And that's how we started our agency, Fullcast, our full service done for you podcast agency. And then, we've launched over 120 shows for our clients. Late 2019, one of my clients gives me the book by Peter Diamandis, Abundance, and fascinating about the future, the potential for the future. And there was a little blurb in there about vertical farming, and I was like, this is interesting. I was like, dug a little deeper, saw that it was a growing industry. I was like, well, I've got the skills. I know how to have long form conversations with people. I had been doing about almost 300 at that time with Podcast Junkies. We know how to produce a show with our agency, and I think this could be a way for me to learn and to bring my listeners along the journey with me. I always say from a podcast perspective, when you listen to podcast interviews, you have to remember that there's 3 people involved in that conversation. There's the host, there's the guest, and then there's the listener. And I always say singular listener because I'm showing my earbuds for those that are watching. But, the listener, there's one person listening to your episode at a time. And never lose sight of that. There's the listener listening right now to this episode. And I'm always appreciative of that. And I always want to remember that we're pulling them into this conversation. And so I started that process. And thankfully, I was able to land a sponsor on the show from day one. Shout out to IGS, Intelligent Growth Solutions. David Farquhar was my first guest. I remember having that conversation with him. He was in what looked like his attic. It was COVID. I started this late 2019. I had no idea what was going to happen a few months later. And I said, do you still want to do this? He's like, yeah, let's do it. And to his credit, we had a fantastic conversation. He's been on 2 more times. He's a great guest, very high energy. I love having him on. And it's been a wild journey. I've had sponsors on the show ever since. Shout out to all the folks that have sponsored the show in the past: Freight Farm Series, Greenhouse Solutions, all the conferences, Indoor AgCon, Indoor AgTech NYC. Cultivated has been a really, really big sponsor and support as well. Vertifarm, I'm headed to Germany this Sunday to go speak
Nice.
at the conference. So it's been a wild journey. I've been learning so much, and I think the timing was interesting in terms of what happened with COVID, and then later on with Ukraine, how this idea of local access to food, supply chain disruptions, fresh food, what it means to actually be local. Because I came to find out later on, you could actually define something as local if it's grown within 400 miles, which doesn't seem very local to me. So now I think a lot of our guests are talking about this idea of hyper-local, which is really interesting for me. So a bit of a long story, but I think wanted to paint the picture of how I ended up here.
Well, that is really interesting context, and my challenge as a host would be to try and pick which part to, insert the questions in and what part to unpack. But I think in service of our audience, which would be largely Western Canadian broadacre producers like us, I would like to start with the vertical farming, and then we'll talk more about the podcasting and the marketing if folks are interested to hang in the conversation and some of the more esoteric things that I want to get to because I like the cut of your jib when it comes to everything you say about amplifying people's voice, and I liked your theme of voices. But in the theme of voices guiding you, what would have compelled you to start a podcast about vertical farming, and what have you learned?
I think it's really curiosity and an understanding that the best way to understand what's happening in the industry, for me, from my perspective at the time, was to talk to the people who were taking a chance on the industry, who were leading teams in the industry, who were starting companies in this industry. So that's why the focus was on founders and CEOs. And it's such a nascent industry, maybe about 10 years, give or take. And so it's not something that's been around for 100 years or 50 years. And what was interesting is as I was having these conversations, I'm interested in origin stories. I love origin stories. I love how people got started and where their interest came from. And by virtue of hearing all the different ways that they were being pulled into the world of vertical farming, I started to paint a picture about why this was important for them, why this is important for the world, why this is important for people to be talking about. And I started paying more attention. I would go into grocery stores, I'd flip over that bag of leafy greens, and I'm like, wow, this is coming from California. And I, at the time, I think I was in New York, and I was like, that's 3,000 miles. And I'm like, how come it only lasts a couple of days? And then after opening, and just curious about really thinking through where our food comes from. And also growing up in New York, I grew up in Yonkers, just outside New York, and I've lived in New York City. I was very aware of, how certain pockets of a city could have a bodega with a cellophane wrapped head of lettuce that who knows where the heck that came from. And, just how underserved communities don't have access to fresh produce. And I would have conversations with some of my guests, and they're like, we would go into a neighborhood, and I was speaking to one of the folks that was doing a project in Las Vegas, and we took a tour last time I was at Indoor AgCon earlier this year of one of those neighborhoods. And, for some of these people, they have never had access to fresh produce. It's something that's brand new for them. Everything comes in packaged goods. I remember walking through the grocery store there in Vegas, and there was a purple Sunkist. And I was just like, this is the epitome of just crappy food. And it's all these people have access to. And so I think what's been interesting for me as I learned more and more, I came into it with a sense of curiosity about the potential for this industry. And it's given me more hope. And I know there's been some ups and downs in recent news with the industry, but I think the overall promise of what's possible and all the different flavors that it can take on, whether it's a huge, company like Plenty or someone doing container farms like freight farms. I think there's a lot of different solutions and a lot of different interesting ways people are tackling this problem, which really never ceases to fascinate me.
Well, just to compare scale and scope, our family farm on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border would cover 20,000 acres horizontally. Why would anyone want to farm vertically? What are the reasons that you would farm vertically, not horizontally?
So it's interesting, as I was having conversations, everyone came at it from a different perspective. And I know a lot of the challenges sometimes is, people looking at vertical farming from a greenwashing perspective. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot. And people not taking into account the full cost, what they talk a lot about CapEx cost when it comes to starting these farms. But it's interesting when you see the change, with the challenges that are happening from a climate perspective, the challenges that we're having with that are being tackled by people who are working on regenerative agriculture, the monocropping that's happening, and the damage that's happening to the soil in traditional agriculture, but also the fact that the way what we're seeing with the climate is that the people are not having the consistency in terms of the conditions that they need to grow this. And a lot of times, a lot of the benefit that happens is you can grow multiple cycles in a controlled environment. I know that some people throw around this idea of it being pesticide free, and just to be completely like transparent from, from every conversations that I've had and what I've been speaking to my guests about, there are issues sometimes with some versions of that, and that can be handled indoors. But there's interesting, as I started to learn more and more, is how you can replicate when you start thinking about the ability to change the lighting, to change the temperature and the humidity, and you start to dial those knobs in pretty consistently. You can really begin to replicate other areas and other regions of the country and grow food consistently. And what we're seeing right now with some of these smaller farms is they're co-locating them next to hospitals, on cruise ships, partnering with grocery stores, partnering with some of these bigger food distribution companies like Cisco. And I think it's really awakening people to the fact that there's an opportunity for not only traditional ag, but also vertical farming to work in partnership with them. I never get the impression that vertical farming is trying to replace traditional agriculture. I think it's really, there's opportunities and locations in different parts of the world where it's really challenging to have a consistent climate throughout the year to grow these crops. And I think that's what's interesting about vertical farming is, through a variety of different solutions, they're tackling those problems.
Love it. Well, you must have had a lot of different voices from the industry over the 9 seasons. Who are the folks that are vertically farming, and why is it them? Is there a correlation or a thread, or they have something in common, or is it really diverse?
I think the first part of it got cut out, but I think you were asking about the correlation between the different types of farms or between the guests.
Yeah, my question is, is there a theme when it comes to who is vertically farming, or they all have their own different reasons? Like, who are the vertical farmers of the world? Because I've never physically met any, and you've met lots.
Yeah, it's interesting because they're all coming at it from a different perspective. And what I found interesting in those, and especially in that first season, I spoke to folks vertical farming, and for me, the definition of vertical farming is a little more narrow than CEA, with controlled environment agriculture, and it's really within a contained system indoors. And I started discovering that people were growing mushrooms, people were growing insects indoors, people were growing fodder for cows, and especially when I came back from Dubai, like the amount of fodder that's needed for the camel population there was like, the numbers were astronomical. It was crazy. And so all these different solutions to tackle specific needs, obviously coming back from Dubai and that whole Middle East area, I mean, they get 90 to 95% of their food imported. And so that's why you see a huge push in a lot of these indoor farming conferences in that area. And it's something that they're becoming more aware of. It's this idea of food sovereignty and having control over, what they have access to, and how, and naturally, like a lot of these, you're not going to feed a population with leafy greens, but they're tackling different problems and trying different solutions. IGS was experimenting with growing potatoes, or at least smaller versions of potatoes indoors, and it tackles different challenges that people have. And there's also seed manufacturers beginning to have different varieties of seeds that work better indoors. And so it's really, really interesting to see everyone from a small farmer who just has one container farm and he has a leafy green business or a basil business, or even someone like the owner of Farm One in New York City. Like he specifically focuses on high-end restaurants, and he's got edible flowers, he's got herbs, and he's developed this relationship in Brooklyn with the farmers there. And I had the ability to go visit that farm when I was at Indoor Ag Tech NYC, and it was just fascinating. It's a small farm. He's not trying to be all things for everyone. He has a unique specialty, and we were in there tasting flowers, and I was like, well, I never even was aware of these flavors available. And it's so niche. It's so niche because he already has his audience, and he knows what he's growing, and he knows who's going to be buying from them. So it's always a challenge, right? Because when you think about these farms, do they have a takeoff agreement? Are they going to? Do they have someone that's going to build a relationship with them? And you're seeing just there's no one size fits all. You do have the plenties that are opening up huge indoor farms in places that are underserved, like Compton. But then one of my previous guests, Ali Daniali, he's got a connection with repurposing container farms, and he's just installed, I think it's about 3 to 5 farms in a non-used space in a low-income neighborhood. They're leasing the space there, and he's already got agreements with Caesar's Palace and the Caesar's Forum, in Las Vegas. So there's ways that they're going to start to like develop relationships. And I think every installation has its own set of challenges, and they're coming at it from different reasons. And there's a wide variety of crops. There's someone I spoke to, Inez Sagrario. She's doing hops for beer indoors in Spain. So it's really interesting. Nice. The more you talk to people, the more interesting people are finding ways to tackle some of these challenges.
I just thought of a really interesting dichotomy where in our business with broadacre farming, you almost have to be grandfathered in. Let's be real. There's very few people that just start farming and scale it, and because it's ownership of the land that's passed down, right? But everybody in vertical farming is probably just getting into it. I mean, I don't know if there's generational vertical farming or not, but what would be some of the barriers to entry to getting started if you're like, yeah, I want a vertical farm, man?
I think what's important is to work with someone who knows the lay of the land. And the 2 companies that come to mind for me are my previous sponsor of the show, Cultivated, and that's spelled CULTIVATD.com. They're a broker, and they work with a lot of different partners. So what's happening is folks that are interested in learning and have an idea for a crop, or they have a budget, or they've got a container farm, or they're looking at a specific location. They work with them to find the best solution. And best of all, you can start working with them for free because they get paid from their partners. And so it's really an easy way to come in and not make a lot of the beginner mistakes in terms of picking the wrong crop, the wrong location, the wrong gear, the wrong equipment. And then also agritecture, which is led by Henry Gordon Smith, who's been on the show a couple of times as well. So I can't say enough good things. Like, if you are going to get into this industry, talk to the people that have been there before, that can do a lot of the hand holding. They've got a lot of models and spreadsheets that they can walk you through to see if the finances make sense, because a lot of times people get into this and they don't do their homework. And even more importantly, they come at it from, understanding or wanting to play with the tech, but not having an understanding about the market they're serving and why are you growing those crops? Do you have a demand in that area? And so really thinking through those issues ahead of time will definitely save you a lot of headache.
So you're saying just like your business helps podcast businesses get off the ground because people have a passion for it, but they might not understand all the pros and cons and the to-do list and what it takes and how much you're going to make. You can hook up with people like that in the vertical farming industry to avoid all those pitfalls.
Yeah. And there's companies like Contain.ag. I've had Nicola on the show before. She's the CEO. They help with the financing as well. So there's a lot of people in the industry that are there to support and help because there's specific intricacies that are involved. One of my most popular episodes was an investor by the name of Michael Sicienza, who specifically he's located in Florida, but he helps companies understand the lay of the land and how to understand how to work with municipalities and how to understand zoning requirements, which is some of the challenges you're having, when people are looking into these projects, especially these bigger ones. Some of the challenges that people don't prepare for is the amount of electricity they might need, and is that area zoned for that? So these little things that you don't think about unless you understand and work with someone who's been down a lot of those paths, who's worked with a lot of installations. I recently had someone on the show, and the episode's not been released yet, but they work with schools that have been abandoned, and they're in historic districts, so they're getting tax credits. And there's certain requirements about what you can and can't do in terms of modifying the school, but they're actually retrofitting them to be an indoor farm. And because they know lay of the land, and this company has experience in real estate, they know they've done this before. They know how to have those conversations with these government agencies and how to understand and take advantage of these tax credits. So now they're creating spaces for farmers to come in and just lease the space and just grow their crop. So now they don't have to worry even about the tech and the building and the being working with landlords. Like, they have someone who specializes that. So it's interesting to see how people are niching down in terms of the service they're providing for this industry.
That's wicked. I'm wondering as you're talking, we might be a little bit fearful in a horizontal farming when we hear about people that are vertically farming because they're about as foreign as aliens coming to the planet might be. But how much output on planet Earth of food that people are eating as consumers is actually vertically farmed? Like it must be an infinitesimally small portion of our food actually comes from vertical farming relative to the industrial, large scale, horizontal farming complex, no?
Yeah, I would think so. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's definitely small. And I think with all nascent industries, I think a lot of it is just understanding the lay of the land and where there's opportunities that vertical farming can coexist with traditional ag or maybe even partner. And what I'm seeing as I go to these conferences is a lot of folks are taking the lead from all the work that's been done historically in the Netherlands. You know, when you think about the amount of greenhouses and the technology and the history that's there, you know, they've really had a great head start in terms of CEA. And so a lot of companies from the greenhouse space, you're seeing them come into vertical farming and working with some of these indoor farming companies and partnerships, and you're seeing now some hybrid solutions. So a lot of times people think like, you know, greenhouses are one thing, indoor farming is another thing. But I think there's lessons to be learned from both, and we're seeing, you know, best practices being applied because, you know, people have been, especially in the Netherlands, they've got the greenhouse down to a science, and they know how to really like turn out and produce a lot of produce, and they've been doing it, you know, for decades, and so they really know what they're doing, and I think having, you know, for lack of a better term, some grown-ups in the room to say, hey, we've got some experience doing this, maybe you want to listen. I think that's been helpful as well.
Is this considered an environmental solution? And if so, why?
I think it might be too early to make that call because there's a lot of challenges in terms of the amount of energy that's required. And so what I've seen is people looking at different solutions for that. One of the companies I spoke to is based out of Iceland, and they're using the thermal energy to I think it's algae is what they're growing indoors for commercial use, and so people are starting to be more creative. I don't know. I don't think we're at the point where anyone is using solar effectively, but I think people are conscious of the load that's needed for indoor farming. So I think they're still working, and there's conversations happening with the LED manufacturers. And even the monitoring, you know, we interviewed a company called Microclimates, and their focus is on creating a dashboard of sensors that gives you a full spectrum, like analysis of what's happening with your HVAC system, with your LEDs, with your electricity, you know, if you've got AI analyzing, you know, your crops for diseases. And so they're bringing them all together into a convenient dashboard with a mobile app. And so there's people trying to solve this from different angles. But I think there's still challenges from an environmental impact perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, you said nascent twice. What is being a nascent industry actually mean?
From my perspective, it's a new industry, you know, that it's still getting their feet wet. You know, there's been a lot of people are speaking right now. When you think about the life cycle of an industry, we're in this, what people are calling the trough of disillusionment. And I'm not sure. I always forget who to attribute that to, but it's coming from the startup and entrepreneurial space about how there's a peak excitement, and obviously that's a lot of what you saw with the initial frenzy of investing into vertical farms and the subsequent bankruptcies and restructurings. And there's a bit of a chill right now when it comes to investing. But I think, you know, everyone that I speak to still is excited about the possibilities. There's excitement when we go to the conferences about the opportunities there, and I think it's an industry, you know, the reason I use that term is that I think from my perspective and what I've seen in the conversations that I've had is that people are still, you know, still new coming into this industry. And there are people that have figured it out and that are having really good success and working with communities in the space and understanding the location of where they're putting a farm. I'm thinking about Vertical Harvest. I've interviewed Nona Yehia. She's the female CEO of that company. I've had her on the show twice, you know, and they've got a special model where they actually hire folks with disabilities to kind of bring that and then within the community and to get them work, because a lot of the work is repetitive if you've got an SOP in place and it's the type of work that's well suited for those folks. And so I think they're looking at different ways to bring the community involved, and they've got a beautiful farm going up in Maine. I think it's going to be up by the end of this year or early next year. So there's some folks that have figured out the model and are doing a really good job of understanding the expenses and the mechanics of like making this work from a financial perspective, and also providing a service to the community and providing food that's needed, and being specific and strategic about where they're placing these farms and where it makes the most sense.
Well, that's really interesting, because I was going to ask you about how does this make maybe a country more food sovereign, which we always think about nations wanting to be food sovereign. Like, we should be doing X, Y, Z in Canada because of, food sovereignty. But I'm thinking with the scalability of this, we could be talking household or individual food sovereignty to some degree, ensuring your household has something to nibble on in the darkest of days.
And the beauty of this podcast is I get to speak to not only the big companies doing amazing things at these huge building factory levels, but also the people doing it at home. And Planiform comes to mind. I had a great conversation with, he's based in Canada, Alberto Aguilar, and they've got a beautiful tabletop unit that grows fresh herbs, basil, and a whole variety, and using seed pods. And it's actually, when you think about something that's going to be in your home, it's aesthetically pleasing, and it's very functional, and it gives people this taste of what it's like to have access to fresh produce in their own home. And I think, you see a variety of that, Tower Gardens, even something like Babylon Microfarms, who work specifically with hospitals and cruise ships, and they're having a lot of success because they've got a target niche, and they're providing someone who needs access to that locally, hyper locally, and the more units they install, the more that they see that it's helpful for them, and they don't have to have this dependency. If you think something like the cruise ship industry, like if they don't have to have the dependency on having constantly produce shipped in, and they can grow it themselves, there's a little bit of that. And I don't know, that's not the home sovereignty you're speaking about, but I think it's interesting because it's awakening people to this idea of having it. And you've seen people experimenting with some of these tower gardens in their garage, in their kitchen, and just experimenting with the different type of crops they can grow indoors.
Can you make a lot of money doing this guy who contacted me was more or less like, hey, I'm interested in vertical farming. Maybe this is the latest, greatest thing. I should be in on this. Is like cryptocurrency or whatever, tulips in Holland back in the day. Like, should we be getting in on this, Barry? Are we missing anything?
Nothing I say can be construed as financial advice.
That's right. I was about to invest. I had my finger on the clicker.
I think what's interesting, I just had on the CEO of Harvest Returns on, and he's got a lot of people that come to him because they basically put together investment pools for people that don't invest in farming companies. So I think working with a company like Harvest Returns would be the best thing to do if you are interested, rather than trying to invest in a specific project, because it's almost like a stock portfolio. They're looking at different companies, and they've gotten burned with a couple of the folks that they've partnered or lent money to in the beginning, and they learned a lot of lessons along the way. So understanding someone they've got the financial acumen, they know the industry because they're having conversations with these people. They know what questions to ask these farmers and these projects. They're looking at balance sheets. They're looking at, income statements. They're looking at these takeoff agreements. They're trying to see, is this a viable business? And do you have a solid plan for putting this together? And so for companies that meet that criteria, those are the ones that they're pulling in, and they're offering up to their investment community and saying, hey, we've been working with these companies. We've done the due diligence. Here are some folks you can work with if you want to learn more. And I think that's really the best way to do that. So I highly recommend to find a company like that that's done the work, because you don't want to be jumping into this with both feet, not understanding anything about the industry, just trying to lay bets as if you're at the craps table and just hoping it lands on black. But I think it makes sense to work with folks who have had the ups and downs, have gotten burned a couple of times, but understand what they're seeing consistently in the companies that are having success in the space.
I remember now what I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you, as somebody who's didn't grow up in agriculture, what surprised you the most, having learned more about food production? What shocked you the most, about where your food comes from? what was it? Kind of a eureka moment. I think about, from our perspective in agriculture, folks in urban centers don't really understand at all where their food comes from.
No.
And now you've got a glimpse in a totally different, like you've got a whole different understanding that we might understand where the food comes from at that level.
Yeah.
It's almost as different.
Yeah, I think the biggest aha for me over the years has been, really just understanding how far food travels and how used to having specific food and produce and fruit on our plate, all throughout all months of the year. When you really sit down and think about it, like, should I be eating a mango in New York City in like December? And I'm like, where does that come from? And like strawberries and how much, and what's this list of the top, most fruits with the most use of pesticides, and how much leafy greens actually comes out of Salinas, California, and how does that get picked, and how does it get here, and how does it stay fresh for so long? There's a book that's really eye-opening that was truly some parts disturbing as well, called The Secret Life of Groceries. I highly recommend it to your viewers and listeners to read, because it's a sobering peek inside of like the whole supply chain in terms of like food, and it digs into like the trucking industry, and it's not pretty, when you think about that, all the different pieces of how food actually gets to your plate. We don't have to even go into factory farms. That's a whole nother discussion in terms of animals, but just specifically dealing with like, produce and vegetables. You think about all the moving parts that are required for that food to get on your plate, that you just kind of like imagine you just go into the supermarket and stare. And all it takes is a little event. I was in New York City years ago during Hurricane Sandy. Everyone experienced it during COVID. Like, you go to the store and then stuff is not on the shelves anymore. And you're like, hey, wait, and I think what's interesting for me and having been grown up in New York, I've lived in LA, and now I live in 30 minutes outside Minneapolis. And, there's deer roaming the property, there's turkeys roaming the property. And I'm having this different perspective of like, food. And thankfully we have a well, so we've got well water. And this idea of sovereignty. We talked about food sovereignty, but this idea of just being a sovereign individual, and what does that mean? And what does that mean for, when you really think about it, and all the different ways that you're dependent on all these systems to work together effectively to get what you need. And so it's been an interesting journey for me, and it's caused me to ask more questions about, where exactly does, that specific food come from? And is it something that I need to have access to, 12 months out of the year?
It is astonishing. And just for the fact that you want this incredible variety of very shiny, different colored foods, available any time of the year, that actually has to look good, and even in terms of its shape, we're involved with reconstituting thousands of tons of produce that gets thrown out of back end of grocery stores. It's technically perfectly good to eat. But we remake it into fertilizer, so that's been fun. But it is an interesting conundrum, because you can be hell-bent for leather on saving planet Earth, but you're probably the same folk that are even eating avocados on their toast every morning.
Yeah.
Where's that avocado coming from, and what is the carbon footprint? But you haven't thought of that yet. And sometimes I wonder, as do-gooders that want to save planet Earth, which we all have the best of intentions, what's the real issue? And sometimes I wonder that about vertically of farming. Like, are we really solving the world's problems? Because when you think about it, I didn't really think about it before we talked. Guess what? We're using the sun. You're not. That's a big difference in energy.
Yeah.
Like, we're at the different starting lines there, bro.
Yeah. And I'm not an actual farmer myself, just for the record.
Right? No, totally. Yeah, nobody's going to be saying like, "Hey, get away with that vertical farmer! You're killing my
Harry,
planet,
man. What's he doing, man?
Yeah,
He's
don't slide in my DMs here and hold me responsible for planet Earth.
It's the bigger question about all these things that are touted as innovations. It's nice to know that, okay, let's get a Tesla. Let's get our car charged at these stations. Where are these stations getting their electricity from? Coal. Like, I mean, it's like, it's not, I would say,
where do rare earth minerals come from? Like the ground in China.
Everyone who's got a phone in their hand, everyone who's watching this is just as culpable in terms of like, so we've all got a part to play in this. And I think just being aware, I think the first step is knowing the impact that you're having by the choices that you make on a day-to-day basis. And then slowly over time, you pick the things that matter to you and you make more conscious decisions if it's important for you. If it's not important for you, just continue living your life and, then, and you're happy with the time you spent on this planet. But if you really think about the global impact, I think if everyone just did a little bit more or just was even more aware, and even these conversations like this help, I think it's just helpful for people to even pause, even if you are going to like buy that avocado, even if you are going to, get that mango, or even if you are going to like buy something and trying to decide whether you're buying it from traditional ag versus something that's vertically farmed, we're all thinking of these different decisions, and people have different things that are important to them, and so sometimes, when I'm there, I'm thinking about like, is it more important that this produce, used fuel to get here and travel thousands and thousands of miles to get to this plate, and it's cheaper, and it used the power of the sun, but it also used the power of coal to get to my plate. So, there's a lot of things to be thinking about. There's no like easy answer for all this. And I know you know this already. So I think it's really having the conversation and being conscious of the decisions you make. And we all kind of like are making these small decisions over time that add up.
Well, I'm very inspired. Like when I get home tonight and I bust into my charcuterie board with kiwi fruit and heavily marbled ribeye and 10 different kinds of cheeses and some nuts from all over the world and various things. I'm gonna pause.
Yeah.
But no, not to make light of it. I do think that's a good point, and I often wonder about that too. Like, this is incredible that we have all this food.
Yeah.
And is it hopefully it's sustainable, because I never want to run out of it, but you might be eating deer meat and chasing turkeys one day. We don't know. But we don't have that much time left, my friend. I really appreciate you coming on, but I just can't help but think of you giving voice, like with the theme of the show here.
Yeah.
You're giving a tremendous voice to all these folks in the industry, and of course everybody who's trying to podcast, but specifically to a whole industry. I mean, I looked for an ambassador and I found you. What has that meant to you, just working and making everybody more aware, giving vertical farming the industry a voice, a platform?
Yeah, I really think that's important, and I'm going to circle back to that story I told you earlier when I came back with my tail between my legs from Atlanta. Mm-hmm. I had a ticket to Thailand. I went to go visit a friend. He's like, I needed a break. I was like, I need to clear my head. So I went to Thailand. I went to Koh Samui. It was like a 26-hour trip. He picks me up on his like little moped, and we start scooting around the island. He's like, let's go see this waterfall. So it was just a fun time. We go up to the waterfall. He's overlooking, I think it was like a half hour to get to the top, and he's at this overlook. And he's like, hey, come over here. Like, I want you to see the view from where I'm at. And I was like, yeah, sure. So I stepped over to where he's going, but I had to step into like a little stream that was there at the top. And I stepped on it, and underneath the stream was like the slipperiest rock you can imagine. So both my legs go up in the air, and I land on my back, and I proceed to be carried towards the edge of the falls. This is happening, Dan, within like seconds. And I was like, I felt like one of those little paper boats that you put like by the sewer, and it just goes. It was so fast, and I could see the edge of the falls, and I could see myself like being carried over. And so I spot a boulder like on the left side of the bank, and I just instinctively stuck out my leg, and I was able to stop. And my friend is sitting there, his eyes are like wide as saucers, and he was like freaking out. Finally, he like pulls me over to the side. I'm shaking, he's shaking. We're kind of freaking out for a second there. We kind of like shake it off, and we're able to have like a great day, great trip. And so I say all this because you never think about these things when they happen in the moment. But then when I get back to New York, and as I start working on this thing, start getting into podcasting, I start talking to people, and you mentioned this concept of your voice, and I was like, like how sad would it have been if I had died with my voice inside me? I was like, it's interesting to think about, if you talk to people, if you go into a bar and there's 100 people in the bar, there's 100 stories there. If you spend enough time with each single person there, every single person has a story to tell. And I firmly believe, and it's the message that I talk about a lot from my agency, from my podcast, in these conversations. Everyone has a story to share. Everyone has a voice inside them that needs to be heard. And I don't want people to wait, like the 30 plus years that I did to kind of figure out that I have something to share and that I can let other people share their voice as well. And so that's something that I've been passionate about. And it's the consistent theme that's been running through me for years now.
I love that, because I think about just for the fact, that we have this podcast and we were able to interview our father with my brother and his son,
Yeah.
in the boardroom at the farm. And we have that forever, and
Yeah.
one day he'll be gone and we'll pull it out. But we have people that have gone before us that we don't have their stories. We have their genetic memory. We have, all that memory of how to grow your nose came from the DNA of our ancestors, and how to, sprint and jump high and, be fantastic hunter and gatherers came from our ancestors. But we don't have their campfires. We don't have the, we don't have that. And so the fact that you're able to put that into existence forever and help a whole industry, help a bunch of people podcasts tell their stories. I mean, how many stories have been told through your efforts that you didn't die in that waterfall?
Yeah.
What is the number?
Yeah.
Zillions.
Yeah. And whether it's people, and I'm sure there's people that I'll never meet that I've impacted. And it's one of the reasons I call the book around the podcast Campfire. If you think about the campfire, if you think about just going back hundreds and thousands of years, like stories have always translated orally, traditions, stories from ancestors and from our, from the people that came before us. And that's the oldest tradition known to man, just to tell stories and pass them down. And now we have the ability to do that, in a digital format, and they live on in perpetuity. And I think it's always interesting to be able to capture, because like you said, to your point, like these voices will be gone at some point, and now we have the ability for future generations to hear them.
Well, it's absolutely awe-inspiring, man. And you got a great vision, and I love what you're doing, and it's been really an honor to have you on the podcast. I like your vision and your mission. I don't know that everybody has that, and it's something I've been thinking more about getting nailed down in my life. If you get to a good place, you can start to think, what is your vision? What is your purpose? What is your mission? What is your core values?
Yeah.
And saying that you are the cosmic conduit for awakened souls ready to transmit their genius on a global scale. What is that? How did you come up with that, and what does that mean to you? And are you living it?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of a lot of work that I did with some coaches that helped me. One of the questions they asked me was like, what's your best in the world statement? And I was like, it feels like a bit pompous to even try to think of something like that. But then as I started thinking about my journey, everything that I've learned in as an entrepreneur, as a podcaster, and everything that involves my spiritual journey, which started like 20 years ago, Buddhism, I got into a whole bunch of metaphysical stuff. And I said, I want to kind of pull this all together. And that's kind of where that statement came from, because I wanted it to repel people almost as fast as it attracts them. Because it's one of those statements that, says, oh, this is who I am. It's sort of wearing my heart on my sleeve. And I'm 52 now. And I'm at the point now where I don't really care what people think about what I say or what I do. It's either going to resonate with you or it's not. And, I'm not for everyone. And I think everyone should take it upon themselves. I heard a coach of mine say one time that the purpose of why we're here on this earth is to share our journey. The ups, the downs, the highs, and the lows, and do it without any filters. I'm learning from people. If you think about this as being on a ladder, like I'm learning from people who are just like a one rung ahead of me, and then I'm trying to help people who are like one rung below me. And I'm just like, hey, I just learned this. I have a weekly newsletter at harryduran.com, and it's just me telling stories. I'm like, hey, I spoke to Dan about agriculture today, or hey, I'm going to Germany to speak at a conference. I don't try to like market anything. I just try to tell people like, hey, I went to the therapist and we talked about my ADHD, or like I was like really having challenges thinking about like all the stuff I screwed up in my first marriage, and just things that human beings talk about. This is real life stuff, and sometimes I think I'm giving permission to people to just say, hey, just talk about the messy stuff, because we're all trying to be this perfect thing, especially in a podcast. People are like, oh, we got to have the perfect mic, or we got to sound good, or I got to have the perfect background. And it's like, that's not real life, and we show the messy stuff, because that's the part where the people hear it and they see it and they're like, oh yeah, that part. Yeah. That's actually the part that resonates the most with me, when you're being real and when you're being raw. And I think I always encourage people to do more of that.
I totally agree. I think it's almost going the other way, where we've had so much technology and so much published material that folks they want to see behind the scenes.
Yeah.
They want things to be real.
Yeah.
They want it to, it's like an integration of your real life as an extension of like, you feel like you're there. It's that comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think there's a switch in our brain with all the information, the advertising. You start to sound too polished, you will get shut out. You will get shut off. Like a biological impetus not to burn calories on things that don't affect your survival. You just, I don't need that information. Yeah. Whereas, if you look at stories from a tribal perspective, it's sort of how we got here, as human beings relative to every other species on on the planet. And so you are expanding that and facilitating that, and it's a great mission, man. I'm so proud of what you do. It's exciting. So good on you, man.
I appreciate you giving the opportunity to tell a little bit of my story. So it was fun to take a trip down memory lane, and I hope I was able to add some value and some entertainment for your audience.
I think it's a really interesting conversation for producers, and I'm kind of wondering, we're talking about people who have land and space and capital and energy, like they have the means to do this.
Yeah.
Maybe they want to farm year round, and they want to farm straight up and down, not sideways like we're used to. I don't know, but anyways, it was very informative for me to get it. And I dream one day of walking down my greenhouse or vertical farming or whatever with the misting of plants or whatever.
Yeah.
And, it seems exciting, but I'm sure it sounds like a painful business proposition, like a lot of other things that looks good from the outside, but it's actually will eat you alive if you don't know what you're doing. So I love it. Law of the jungle.
And maybe there's opportunity at an upcoming conference, depending where you're at. And I'm sure we'll stay in touch. But maybe we can meet at a conference, and I'll give you a tour of not the tour of the farmers, but I'll make the intros to the people. And I think seeing it firsthand, and having those conversations with those people, I think would be pretty helpful.
Well, I might just phone up the guy that was interested in learning more about vertical farming and see if he wants to take me to Germany, because he's got lots of money. So, yeah, I really appreciate it, man. And how do people, that's what I want to ask. How do people get a hold of you if they are interested in vertical farming?
The best way is to dive into some of the episodes of verticalfarmingpodcast.com. And if you want to connect with me, I'm Harry Duran on LinkedIn. And I am Harry Duran on Instagram and Twitter, or X, I guess it's called now. But that's probably the easiest way. I've got, like I mentioned, a weekly newsletter called at harryduran.com, which is more of like the personal side and just inspires people to be a better version of themselves.
Sweet. That's Duran, like Duran, exactly. For anybody who missed that. So appreciate it, brother. Keep it real. I'm proud of you. Great having you on the show. And thanks for your time, man. It means a lot.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. I appreciate the thoughtful questions, and hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.